All right, welcome back, everybody, to another podcast from Hard Hat Uncovered. This is podcast number 4, and we are coming to you live from the Hard Hat Uncovered studios in Alexandria, Virginia. And, of course, as always, we have Lieutenant Oates.
How you doing?
And Mr. Dylan Hipple.
Hey.
Hey, so you're Lieutenant Oates. What's Dylan?
It better be good. I know what you're thinking. You can't say that online.
No, we can't say that.
What?
I don't know. Maybe our listeners one day can throw something.
We're going to call him Sergeant First Class.
Sergeant First Class? So then I guess I'll settle for the PFC. How's that?
Negative. You're Major.
Major pain.
Major pain. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Help.
So if you don't understand what that cadence means, you got to listen to podcast number 3. And so you'll understand what the cadence means. So welcome back again, everybody, to Hard Hat Uncovered. And today we're going to be talking about just excavation protection on the job site. And I'm sure every one of us has some type of story either that we've dealt with, seen, heard about, read about, seen videos on. I mean, the excavation issues that are out there is just it's through the roof, right? So
right. I mean, and that's why OSHA has the excavation, the emphasis on excavation protection right now. So that they've been putting that out for a couple months, but I think it's in full effect as of either last week or 2 weeks ago, where they are really cracking down on making sure that we're protecting ourselves in excavations, and they're telling all of their officers out in the field to really emphasize excavations and in the way we're protecting them.
Yeah, I mean, and rightfully so. Typically, when there's some type of excavation failure and people are in there, if that unfortunate event happens, there is typically an injury that comes out of that, and then always the worst case scenario that a fatality, someone's been engulfed by dirt,
right,
or something, some other type of material.
And you always say we look at the numbers as safety professionals because we do. We look for trends, we look for numbers, and if you go back probably the last 10 years, deaths due to excavation failure has either been a steady number or a steady increase. It's not declining like it should be. So, and that's one of the main reasons for the emphasis on it.
Yeah, it's as these buildings get bigger, or warehouses get bigger, or whatever the case, or some scenarios where we just know that there's going to be a lot of heavy weight on a location. Now we're just having to do more excavation and trenching, and on top of that, it's not like back in the early 1900s where they were just running pipes and old school electrical wiring outside of a building, and just wherever it hung, that's just where it hung.
Right.
And now everything, we want it to look pretty.
Yep.
So a client or a customer doesn't want their new building to have wires running everywhere outside of the building.
And we got to go around or under all that old stuff that's kind of going everywhere. So that's another big issue we run into.
So now we're having to do more excavation and more trenching.
Right.
Like I said, whether it's just for protection reasons or just because it's going to look prettier to be under, right? So I think we're going to start off with the technical stuff, right? So we'll get the safety nerdy stuff out of the way.
Nothing nerdy about it, Judy.
Right, so I think we'll use this to build the foundation. But, when it comes to sloping and benching, right? So, Dylan, just tell us the difference just between the sloping and the benching so people can understand what we're talking about.
So there's different, sloping and benching requirements depending on the type of soil. So typically you'll see different requirements for type A, type B, and type C soil. So type A soil is going to be your clay, your nice solid soil, and when you're sloping, you're going to slope at a ratio of 3/4 to 1. So if you are 12 or 15 feet deep, it means you're 12 feet back. That's at your 3/4 to 1. Type B soil is going to be your 1-to-1 ratio. So this is another pretty solid type of soil that sticks together pretty well. And when I say 1-to-1, I means if we are 12 feet deep, we are 12 feet back. And then thirdly, we have type C soil, which is a ratio of 1.5 to 1. And this is what most job sites are going to classify soil as type 3. And the reason being is type C is the worst case scenario. As companies, we're always going to want to go above and beyond to protect our employees. So if we're sloping at a ratio of 1.5 to 1 for type C soil, we're giving our employees the most protection. So, and another reason that companies choose type C soil over the other types is to classify as another type of soil, you have to do geological testing and prove to me that it's either type A or type B. Whereas if you say it's type C, there's no testing that needs to be done. It's type C is the worst, so we're going to say type C.
Yeah. So to break it down, I think the easiest thing we can say is, so for the individuals out there that really don't mess with a lot of trenching excavation, basically, if we're going to call something type A, we're going to call it some type of sturdy rock, some type of stable rock, something that if I'm going to go on the side of the mountain and do a cutout or something like that, that's typically what you're going to consider to be a type A.
Right, something that's not going to break away when you start to excavate.
Right. And then a type B is going to be something that's not as strong and stable as a type A. But let's think about something like some of your types of clays that are out there.
Silty loam. And
right, that they're really going to stick together and they're not going to break apart. Basically, when I pick it up, it's just not going to fall apart in my hands. And the last one, which is the typical one, which is type C, that's something more of a sand that you're going to see out there, something that's been pre-disturbed already. And like Dylan mentioned, the problem is if you try to classify something as a type B nowadays, is that just because one area is a type B, you might get about 6 feet over, and now you're into a pre-disturbed area where they laid some type of underground sewer or conduit or something like that. So now you went from a type B down to a type C within a 6-foot range, and now you're going to have to bring somebody out for every one of those instances to make sure that you're staying in that type B category. So,
right, and that's why it's the best solution is just to classify everything as type C.
Yeah, it's definitely makes it a lot easier. So now, how do we know we're doing the right thing when it comes to benching and sloping? Or I'd say this, the question should rather be, how do I know if I can bench or do I need to slope in those areas?
So you're really looking to see if the area in which you're working is wide enough to accomplish that. So, if you want to slope, you got to make sure we have enough room outside of the excavation that we can actually slope those sides back. And then, as you mentioned, sloping versus benching. Well, benching can only be accomplished in type A and type B soil. You cannot bench in type C soil. So that's another reason you won't see benching very often on sites because, like I mentioned earlier, most things are classified as type C soil. So if someone's benching, that means they had someone out there to verify that soil was stable and it's in either A or B soil.
Yeah, and so again, we're going to break down some of these technical terms that we're using. So basically, if you go out into a job site and you see an excavation, when we refer to benching, basically it looks like stairs.
Right, it's steps.
Yeah, we're making steps out there out of the material, whatever it is, whether it's rock or, again, that clay that's out there. And the slope is just basically going to be like the side of a hill.
Right, it's slanted outwards. So, your excavation will look kind of like a V. It slopes down into a wider point at the bottom.
Yeah, and I know I've been on jobs where it almost seems like we want to do the default of, hey, we're just going to slope everything back and we're just going to pull everything back. It's easier to do it. It takes a lot less time for the operator to do it and things of that nature. However, it's not always feasible to do out in the field because it does take up a lot of room to do sloping.
Right. And typically in major cities or areas that have high number of residents, there's not enough real estate, not enough room to actually be able to slope or bench your excavations back. So you won't see it in those types of scenarios. You mostly see benching or sloping whenever you have a lot of room to work with on your construction site.
Yep, and so I'm from the Houston area. Right now we're working around the Virginia, the Washington, D.C. area. Damon, think about in Detroit. How many scenarios would you see in downtown that you would be able to slope back a road in downtown
You
Detroit.
You wouldn't. It's too tight down there. You know.
So then,
Everything's close together.
so if that's the case, Lieutenant Oates, what's an alternative?
Well, using trench boxes, shoring systems, pneumatic shoring, hydraulic shoring, different things like that.
Yeah, and typically that's what we run into, right? Now, with that being said, now excavations and trenches, in my opinion, already bring their own sets of hazards, right? Getting all kind of hazards come associated with it. You have undermining, which means that the underneath is starting to erode
fall
away.
Yeah.
You have just different type of fissures, and these are real technical things that we're probably gonna have to save for another day, because this is.
Yeah, we're trying to keep this 20 minutes. If we start talking about that, we'll be here for an hour.
I sat in, when I became excavation competent, I sat in a 40-hour training in 1 week.
Yeah, and that's what it takes to be really competent in excavations is 40 hours of training, because there's so much that goes into it, so many different aspects that you have to know about.
So now, with that being said, though, like Lieutenant Oates said, there is an alternative, right, for shielding and shoring. But now that brings an additional set of hazards.
Right. There's pros and cons to each type of situation. So we'll talk about trench boxes for a second. The purpose of a trench box is going to be to protect that worker from a cave-in. The thing that people sometimes don't understand about a trench box, it's not there to support the face of the trench or the walls. It is there strictly to protect the workers. Whenever you're installing these, there's a lot of different requirements for installing them. One of the main ones is whenever you backfill, you have to backfill tight up against this trench box to make sure that it can't be moved, it can't be displaced. So we have to compact the soil around it. I know a lot of times you'll see people not realizing they have to do that. They'll just sit the trench box down in, and they might have a couple feet gap on each side, and they don't realize that's hazardous to put your employees in that type of situation.
So Damon, you ever been down in a trench box and had to mess with piping, welding?
Absolutely.
Now,
Yep.
So in that scenario, we have to have some piping down there, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where these trench boxes come into play. And so, but you still got to follow a guideline, right? The pipe still has to come in, but you still got to make sure that you're not exceeding, more than a certain amount of gap, right?
Yeah.
I can't have a piece of pipe in there and then be missing three panels or something like that out of the box itself.
Right.
It has to be no more than 2 feet, right, for A and B, and then on type C, it has to be solid to the ground, right?
Exactly. That's what I was just going to bring up, and that's something that
He
a lot
beat you
of
to
people. Yeah, he beat me to it. A lot of people in the field don't realize that, though, that they always hear that 2 feet thing and they think they're good all the time. But like you just said, type C soil, it has to be solid to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, now I know if I'm a worker down in the field, down into a trench, which I have been. It's very reassuring that knowing that I have some type of protection.
Yes.
But again, if we're not doing these things like backfilling all the way up to the box, if we're not properly having all the panels in place and so forth, now that has just created an additional hazard. So if there's a cave-in, and that box can't support the cave-in.
And it gave you a false sense of security while you were down there, right? I mean, you go down in there, you're inside a trench box, you think you're good. Well, not exactly. We got all these other things to worry about now. And we have like you just said, the added hazard of potentially a trench box collapsing on top of you because you don't have it installed properly.
Right.
Yeah. And so those, the disadvantage is those boxes and those panels and stuff, they're pretty big, right? So there's some of these panels are 4x8, 2x4, then you have timbers, and then you have, these aluminum boxes and so forth. But one thing I will say that I've noticed throughout the years is that they are building them to be a lot easier to install.
Yes.
Basically just come in with a backhoe or a crane or whatever
And
the case.
sit it down in.
And just drop it straight in.
Yeah.
And they're making them smaller, where the configurations are going to be for more, tight fit. I think I've seen some out here on our jobs that are fitting now like in a 3x3.
Oh yeah, they're making them very small. But one of the major disadvantages, it doesn't fit in all scenarios. So, Damon, you could probably tell us multiple instances where a trench box just isn't going to work. So we got all these different utilities running around.
Different things running in the trench. So, yeah, it's a lot of different situations. And I've actually seen people go down where they didn't have a trench box. And as soon as they got out, the walls collapsed. You
Oh,
know what I
yeah.
mean? Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, that was one of those type of situations you look back on and said, this is what we should have did. We didn't do it. And luckily, nobody was injured. There was no incident. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And when you're working in cities, especially that have a long history and are growing pretty fast, they typically have a lot of underground utilities. Especially if they have an old infrastructure, you're going to have utilities running every which way, and sometimes that trench box just isn't going to fit. It's just not going to be the right solution. So we have to come up with another solution.
Right.
Yeah, and I, when I sat in that class, they showed a video and they did slow motion of this, and I like the way the instructor explained it. He called it the running of the rats. So think about a ship sinking and out in the water, and one of the clues that the captains back then or the crew members, they would be looking for is that when they started seeing this trail of rats running up,
Means it was flooding.
it means it was flooding, right?
Yeah.
And so he gave us this scenario, and he showed us where all these, he did in slow motion, and all these little trickles of dirt started running down. And he said he called that the running of the rats. He's like, that's a sign that you're about to have failure in your excavation. But then they went ahead and he played it in normal time. He didn't speed it up. And he showed how fast it was an intentional collapse in this video. It was for training purposes. But they timed it, and they showed how fast the dirt was falling and all that. And so the dirt was falling it was like 54.8 miles per hour when it collapsed. So think about it. If you're in a trench that's 6 foot long, you know, or you got to travel 6 foot to get
to your ladder to get out.
Just 6 feet, not the, what is it? I can't even think, the 25 feet.
25
Yeah, the
foot,
25 feet. So not even the 25 feet. Let's say I got to run 6 feet because now there's a collapse. So who's the fastest
I think
person you could think besides Usain Bolt? Maybe Richard Sherman, since he's a 49er player right now.
okay.
You know, Richard Sherman. You know,
Whatever.
Right.
But think about the fastest guy. Who, top of your head, who's the fastest person you could think?
Usain Bolt.
Okay, Usain Bolt. That's an easy one, right? That's what I was
Right.
thinking, right? I don't care if you're Usain Bolt. You're not going to run away from that wall collapsing fast enough to make it. You know what I mean? And typically your construction workers aren't that in that kind of shape like Usain Bolt or Richard Sherman.
Right.
You know, they're not in that kind of ability. They don't have that ability to run that fast.
Not even so much run that fast, react that fast.
Right.
You know what I mean? By the time they know it's coming down, it's too late.
Yep, it's already on top of them.
Yeah, it's
Now,
too late.
You know, on the same note, I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. There's a video out there of an ocean inspector, and it's been all over LinkedIn and other
I think
social media
I know what you're about
platforms.
to say.
The ocean inspector shows up. Employees are inside of an excavation, probably about 10 feet deep.
Yep.
It's not protected. He tells them to get out. As they are climbing out, it collapses,
Yep.
and he has the whole thing on video. So it's something I encourage you to go watch. You know, we'll try to maybe incorporate it in here.
Somehow, the link or something.
Yeah, I don't know if we're that tech savvy yet in our operations, but you know, I encourage you to go try to find it because it you know, it really sheds light on this situation, how fast it can happen.
Who's in charge today? Huh? Who's in charge today? How you doing? I'm in the state of Oregon, OSHA. Looks like you got a little bit of a shoring problem going on.
That's it. That's what we're installing right now.
Well, he can't be down there.
Okay.
How are you going to get him out?
Showing or what? Jim, just unhook that thing. Sorry. Watch it.
You want to see why he can't be down there?
What?
That's why he can't be down there.
Okay, it's still sheets you gotta go in.
Okay, you got to get him out. And I hope you get him out soon.
Go. Come on. Come on.
How long you guys been working here?
About 3 hours.
Okay. How deep are you there?
About 21 feet.
Now, fortunately, we're in a country that has a lot of safety procedures, regulations. But if you really want to get out there and look at some of these videos where across the world, where people are getting inside these trenches, these excavations, that are just unbelievable. And unfortunately, there's a lot of videos floating out there of filmed collapses with people still down in there.
Right.
You know, from not you know what, not even from around the world. That still happens here. You know, in the United States. I unfortunately see stories about where people were down in trenches, in excavations that was collapsing. You know, and an individual didn't make it. I've seen videos where a very I guess you say a very tough video to watch where an individual is up to his waist in a collapse and he can't get out, and they called his spouse to come and say, hey, look, he's talking, you need to talk to him. Once we remove the dirt, he's not going to make it.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this video thinking, how is that possible?
Well, why can't they save him? Yeah, no,
Right.
that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, and so and in the video they kind of explain that the blood starts to thicken up because the circulation's not flowing, and sure enough, once they moved the dirt away, he literally just fell right over.
All that pooled blood became toxic, and
Right.
as soon as you pulled it away, all that toxic blood ran back to your heart, and that's what caused you to die.
Yeah, because it's one thing when you're holding some dirt in your hand, but when you get an actual weight of dirt, a cube of dirt or however you want to put it, a yard of dirt, something like that, it's now like just having a car on top of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there is no really digging your way out. Those when they call those people survivors that dug themselves out of a collapse or something, or survived or collapsed, they really are survivors, because that's not the typical scenario. Isn't that you're going to survive the collapse?
Right.
You're not going to live through it. So I know we got off course there, but so going back, so we talked about the trench boxes, and shoring systems, and just the different types, right? There's pneumatic shoring, which is using air.
Yeah. And the main point I'll bring up, the main difference between trench boxes and shoring systems is, a shoring system is used to support the face of the trench. That's what it's there to prevent the soil from moving. It's there to provide support against the outside, whereas trench box, like we talked about, is there to protect the workers and not support the trench itself. So I just wanted to bring that up as the main difference between the two systems.
Yeah, and so I was saying we have pneumatic, which is obviously air. Damon, what's another type that you can think of?
Hydraulic shoring would be another type.
Yep.
Yep.
And so some of I could tell you, some of those can get costly. I mean, I'm not going to lie. One thing that I think we got to struggle with, but one thing I think we're trying to be honest and transparent about on our podcast here, is that some of this stuff does cost money. And I know we hear that constantly out on the job sites. If they're out there and they only have a $1 million contract, well, to the common ear, it might sound, man, $1 million, that's a lot of pocket change they're about to make. But if you factor in the equipment rentals, the cost of hiring a crew to do this, all the materials and everything, and if that contractor at the end of the day is only going to walk away with $20,000 for
Right,
that
they
contract,
have that small profit margin.
Right.
now you're going to tell them, hey, out of your $20,000, drop another $10,000 on trenching boxes or shoring boxes.
To switch to hydraulic or pneumatic shoring. Yeah, I mean, it is, cost is a big thing you have to consider when talking about the excavation protection.
And typically we give the default answer of, yeah, but what's going to cost more, a trench box or a fatality? But again, for us, it's a no-brainer because we're in safety. For us, it's a no-brainer that the value of a person's life, the value of their well-being is going to outweigh cost 1,000%. And I know that's not a real
Right,
number.
but when you're that guy that's trying to make money, he's willing to take a chance. Because he's been doing it for years. Most people give that excuse, oh, yeah, we've been doing it like this for so many years. But, at the end of the day, when there is a fatality, then that's, way worse than taking $10,000 to spend on the proper equipment that you needed for excavation. So
Right. We keep talking about the pros and cons of each different system. Personally, I like hydraulic shoring systems the best for multitude of reasons. They're lightweight, can be installed by one person. They have gauges, so you can know that there's even pressure distribution between each of the struts. One of my favorite features is they can be preloaded, so you can kind of gauge the width of your excavation, and you can preload your jack before you sit it down in, and then you can have that support. the number one thing, though, is they can be installed without actually entering the excavation. And,
Right,
and
from
that's
up
my
top.
number one thing about this, is we can protect our workers before they get in the excavation.
Right.
Yeah.
Unlike the screw jack system.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Heavy components. You know, you actually got to get in the trench and operate the screw jacks to set them. You know, to set the braces and whatnot. And that can be pretty dangerous because if you have a cave in, then you're already in there. You're already in the box.
Right.
Yeah, and so again, you got to get in there. So now you're exposing an employee, or even yourself, right? Because this kind of stuff happens. People do this in their own residential, in their own home,
Right.
trying to do their own sewer system or whatever.
Dig a French drain. What?
Yeah, so these kind of things even happen at home, and of course, if I'm doing work at home, then I'm going to go with the screw jack systems because it's probably the cheapest thing, right? Just throw up some pieces of plywood and throw this screw jack, manually, a manual screw jack in between. But I know, again, so it's heavy equipment that you're trying to handle on your own, down in there, and when you got to adjust them, or if they just loosen up on their own somehow or another. I was on a job where an employee was trying to move one over, and it loosened up, and the whole screw jack fell and landed and
Right
hit him
on
on the
his
head,
head,
and it hurt his neck pretty good. And so, and this was I know the guy personally, and he was a tough guy. So when he came and told me that he was hurt, I said, "This
knew
guy's
he was
hurt."
hurt,
Yeah,
yeah.
he was not faking it. I said, "Man, this."
Yeah.
And then we went over there, and it was a big, I don't even know, like an 8-foot long screw jack or something like that, and it landed right on his hard hat. Fortunately, and I told him that. I said, "See, look," I said, "Aren't you glad that we make y'all wear hard hats? Because you imagine what the damage that would have done."
Oh, yeah, if you weren't wearing a hard hat, yeah.
Oh man, it would have
Knocked you out.
How they
Split you
say,
wide open.
How they say in Detroit, split his wig.
Split his wig, split him to the white meat.
And so that sometimes it's hard to explain that to the guys out in the field, like, hey, this is the right thing to do, and this is why. But ultimately, it is the right thing to do. No matter how you do it, again, there's advantages and disadvantages to every single system. But when it comes down to it, each system is almost built the same. They're not built identically the same. So we need to make sure that we're following what the manufacturer says. Mm-hmm. If there's ever any questions, reach out to the manufacturer. If you have a safety guy on your site, a safety professional on your site, reach out to them, use them as a resource. But don't go in there blindly. Don't go in there thinking you know how to do it. Don't go in there thinking, oh, well, I've been using this system, on the last 20 trenches, excavations I've done. This is the way to do it.
Yeah, you have to know your scenario. Each excavation is going to be completely different, so picking the right system is going to be important. And then, like Junior said, know the manufacturer's recommendations, but to one extent further, know their recommendations for each soil type. So something I run into is I'll be out on the site and they have their timber shoring set up, and they don't have the whalers as close as possible, their vertical supports. And they say, oh, I don't have to. I can have, so-and-so gap. That's not true in type C soil. And if we're classifying everything as type C soil, your uprights have to be as close as possible to protect your worker. So each type of system has its own requirements depending on the soil typing.
Yeah. And so now let's go, and I'm glad you talked about the soil typing, because now as you start to think, this is the outside factors of the box or the system I need to use. But now let's go one step further, which I always like to do. If y'all have noticed on the podcast,
yeah.
I always like to take it one step further. So let's go one step further. Let's look beyond the type of the soil, or for your youngsters out there, y'all might not know this phrase, but there's a phrase out there from a cartoon that says "look beyond what you see," and so that's Lion King, Dylan, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we call him Youngster. Youngster.
I know Lion King, man.
Okay, look beyond what you see. So beyond the soil, now what's on the other side of the factor of where your box ends, and now the sidewalk begins. Now the telephone pole begins. Now the house. Now the skyscraper. Whatever it is.
So that brings me back to my other point I made earlier. The difference between trench boxes and a shoring system. That shoring system's there to support those things. It's supporting that face. It's supporting that sidewalk. It can support those utilities. It can support that adjacent building. So knowing the type of system for the scenario is important.
Yep. Now, before we even put the system in place, I'm the operator. I'm digging. And I'm digging. And we're not going to get into utility strikes because that's a whole nother,
that's another podcast.
that's a whole nother beast to talk about. But as I'm digging my trench and as I'm digging my excavations, I need to be aware of my surroundings because as we're exposing, let's say maybe the concrete that's holding a telephone pole in place.
Right.
You know, the footing of a building.
The foundation,
Yeah,
you know.
all of this stuff that as an operator and I'm digging this trench and this excavation, I need to take those types of things into consideration because if that's the cornerstone of a building and now I have removed 3/4 of the dirt that's holding it in place, if I remove that dirt from around it, now what? You know, now I got a building coming down on me. We haven't even made it to the point where we're ready to go in the trench.
Right.
So now that's a
whole other hazard we just uncovered.
yeah, like Damon likes to talk about all the pre-planning and stuff that he talks about in other podcasts. I mean, that's part of that phase.
Right. You got to plan the work. You know, a lot of people miss that. You know, they just think that they're supposed to go out there and do the work that's on the book. But you got to plan it. You got to look at all of these things so nothing will happen like that.
And blueprints aren't going to show you everything.
Absolutely.
You know, how many times have you gone to a job site and your blueprints aren't even close?
Oh, the line's right here. You sure?
I found it over here.
Right, absolutely.
Found it 7 feet away from where you told me that this
Absolutely.
was supposed to be.
Yep.
So that's where you got to reach out. You have to do your due diligence as your crew supervisor, as the CEO of your company, as whoever, as the operator, is to make sure, look around. Hey, I'm next to a building. Did we take that into consideration? Hey, I see a fire hydrant there. Are we taking that into consideration? No. Hey, there's a house over here. Are we taking into consideration utilities that might be in the area? So that's all, like you said there, Damon, that's all part of the pre-planning process.
It's called planning your work and working your plan.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
right.
If you follow plan your work and work the plan, shouldn't have any issues. But if you just go out there like a cowboy and start shooting up the whole site, you know, you might have some issues.
You are a cowboy.
Yep. So working the plan, right? Or like, you know, I used to say is, you know, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail, right? So all those things that we can say as reminders, but when it comes down to it, if you're not reminding yourself to do that stuff, then all those sayings, those cliches, all of that doesn't matter.
Right.
Because then on your tombstone, we could put "Here lies the man that knew the cliche."
Right.
You know, or however you want to put it, right? So,
you know, all those points bring us to one thing, though. You know, the priority is protecting the worker.
Absolutely.
Everything we just talked about, our number one priority was protecting ourselves and our fellow employees. So, you know, that's the main thing we want to take away from this, knowing the advantages and disadvantages of each situation, pre-planning your work, you know, how to prioritize things. Each system is going to offer its own unique advantage and disadvantage. So we need to be able to put into practice what is the best for our scenario.
yeah, because there is no silver bullet, right?
No, there's no cookie cutter plan for every situation.
All right, and I tell you what, these podcasts are getting more and more interesting, and I really think we could have created a whole nother series of podcasts just for excavation protection. But
Oh yeah, for sure.
maybe we'll figure out how we can circle this back around and touch a little bit more, maybe on the misutility side of it, or something like that. So, all right. With that being said, that is another one in the books, gentlemen. That is podcast number 4, and Dylan, why don't you close us out with our mission statement so everybody can remember?
Yeah, we're going to keep repeating it. That way everybody takes note of it. So remember, making a change impacts me, making a difference impacts others, and making history impacts the world.
Thank you, Dylan. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter at Hard Hat Uncovered, or just follow us on our hashtag Change One Thing. And again, coming to you live from the studios of Hard Hat Uncovered. I like doing that.
Just like changing the voice. Welcome back,
Welcome back, brother. That's podcast number 2. Oh, that was part 2.
Yeah.
All right, everybody.